then she's like, yeah, and then click, 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 and blah, blah, and click, and then it's so distracting. Nobody pays attention to the rest of the talk, right? Because she's just flipping through slides, and everybody knows they just want her to sit down. Yeah. I've seen you present. You're interactive. Does it involve you turning to my neighbor? I hate those things. This is like,
can you drink the water?
there is nothing, this is right. Is this right? There's nothing that makes me more anxious than okay, when somebody goes, role play, now I'm like, this is just a little switching roles. I'm introducing you. Yes. Hi, everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I know people come in. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. MacLean, who's our speaker today for the Transplant Institute. Dr. MacLean has served several roles here at Henry Ford. She's been the director of the psychiatry residency program. She's heavily involved in the education of our entire physician group. Took a little hiatus over to WSU, where she was the, let's see, I have to read, I'm blocking this part out because I'm glad she's back now. She was the Associate Dean of Student Affairs and Career Development at Wayne State, and is now back here and in charge of our physician wellness program, actually. And it's in that capacity that she's really going to talk to us today on ways to build resilience for healthcare providers. So she's an outstanding resource, and I'm looking forward to her talk.
Thank you, Dr. Brown, and thanks for your warm welcome back. So I understand that I have a mixed group. Not everyone out in the audience today is a physician. We have some nurses and probably some physician extenders. I did try to customize this. I mean, there is some physician data, but I also included some nursing data and some transplant data as well, just to kind of get a sense of who I'm talking to. How many of you are physicians? And how many of you are physician extenders or NPs, APPs? Okay, and then nurses? Students? Okay, great. I apologize if I've missed a group. So today we're here to talk about building resilience. And I think in order to kind of set the platform for that discussion, we need to talk a little bit about what really burnout is all about. What are some of the drivers of burnout? I'm going to show you some data that I've collected since I've been here. We'll talk a little bit about the education that we undergo in order to become healthcare providers, contributes to our feelings of burnout, and then we'll really get into a very, I think, provocative video that I'm going to show you on resilience. We'll talk a little bit about your reactions to that video, and then we're going to get into some meat in terms of what you can do on the front line to build some of your, to build your own personal resilience. So what is burnout? I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these foundational slides because many of you have heard much of this, but it's really a negative state of physical, emotional, and mental exhaustion that has comorbid symptoms of depersonalization, in which you kind of feel outside of your body and you feel disconnected from what is happening in those patient interactions. The end result of it, though, is that you don't feel a strong sense of accomplishment anymore. anymore. You don't feel like the work that you're doing is fulfilling and satisfying and that you're really making a difference. And I would say that in talking, I give a variety of different talks, and one of the talks I give is on the healing properties of being a doctor. And I think most of us feel like we were called to the profession because we really want to help people, whether or not that's as a physician or a nurse or a physician extender. We really hope to have impact. So if you get to a point in your career where you're really not feeling like you're having that personal touch, that personal impact, it can be very demoralizing. It's not really the same as depression, though I think ultimately if you ignore those signs and symptoms of burnout, it can certainly become depression. And we do find that it is more likely to happen in highly motivated individuals, which is all of you. In terms of, and I'm going to show some nursing data as well, but in terms of this is data from both 2014 to 2017, and you see the dark blue is what the data showed in 2014, and the light blue is when they rechecked it, the burnout rates in 2017. You see in every single specialty, the rates of burnout are increasing, and now the data is really showing that about 50%, if not more, in every single specialty, we are seeing signs and symptoms of burnout. So we did gather some data here. The ACGME, if you don't know this, mandated in this past academic year that we have to offer a mechanism for residents and fellows to measure their own well-being. We have to have some way to do it. And so we picked a tool called the WellBeing Index. It was a tool that came out of Mayo. Why did we pick this particular tool? Well, first of all, for the resident questionnaire, it was only 7 questions, and for the faculty, it was only 9 questions. It had national comparative data because so many other health systems were investing in the same tool, and then it allowed us to embed our own personal resources at the very end, and so we really liked that. But it did allow us to really drill down and see across specialties how much distress our physician groups were experiencing. And the red line is where I thought it would be interesting for you to see. And I don't know if you noticed this in the previous slide. Transplant looked like, I think I saw it on here. No, I'm not seeing it on here, but you see that in terms of our own personal data, that transplant really kind of fell in the middle of the pack. So not the most distressed, but certainly not the least distressed either. In terms of the scope and effect of burnout, we know that it's really one of the reasons why so many medical schools have opened across the nation in the last 10 years is because there's been a prediction that there's going to be a national shortage, ultimately, of healthcare providers for our aging population. So you can imagine if 50% of our physicians are becoming burned out and may not ultimately have sustainability in medicine, that this is going to put a big crunch on how we can provide healthcare in a societal way. So burnout, as we know it, is one of the single biggest threats to any individual doctor's career. And ultimately, they asked a question on a 2012 survey that said that if they had the means, over 50% of physicians would retire immediately if they could. And that's pretty scary, as we know, with so many people aging in the United States. So what about some of this data in burnout? I mean, some of this data, the burnout data in nurses. We do see that that it's not just physicians, it's healthcare providers as a whole that are experiencing burnout. In terms of the data that I got from the literature, it looks like it seems to be a little bit higher in military versus civilian nurses. You guys are in a high acuity field on the front line, and it does mean that you're going to be at greater risk for developing burnout. Those at higher risk have extended work hours, more stress, and high and intense patient workloads. I'm sure that's not any of you guys sitting out here today, right? Yeah. I mean, I can imagine that the work that you do in highly critical situations is extremely stressful, and that at times, because of the nature of what you do, you just need to be here for longer periods of time. We know that just like some of the burnout data relates to bad outcomes in physicians, we see some of those similar negative outcomes for our nurses as well. More needle sticks, more injury, more job dissatisfaction, more absenteeism, and ultimately not having enough staffing to deliver the care that we want to deliver. So what about in transplant medicine? If I know that Dr. Abeljoud is very well known within the department to be a champion of wellness. He's been collaborating with Dr. Michelle Jesse, who's also in your department, and they've published quite a few articles on burnout. And this is two different articles that they've published in the last several years. And no surprise, it does show that there's some pretty significant rates of emotional exhaustion and low personal accomplishment in transplant nurses, in addition to some depersonalization, not as much as the exhaustion and accomplishment, and it appears to be correlated with a variety of different factors. And we saw some of the same data amongst our transplant surgeons, that there was also higher degrees of exhaustion and low personal accomplishment. And the contributing factors, it varied depending on the parameter we were measuring, really had to do with some of those things that we just talked about. Working more, not feeling like you have decisional authority, those difficult high acuity patient interactions, not having as much experience or seniority. With transplant surgeons, again, very similar types of correlations. So ultimately, what is the cost of burnout? We talked a little bit about how it can impact our nurses, but ultimately, it really impacts the whole healthcare system. That we see decreases in quality of care, in patient satisfaction, in morale, and just in your sense of connectedness to the work that you're doing. In addition to that, we see an increase in error, malpractice risk, physician and staff turnover. And interesting, there's been a lot of data as we're trying to make arguments for burnout prevention programs on how much does it really cost. Does anyone out here know how much does it cost to replace a physician? One physician. Yeah. 3 times their salary. So probably that does come, Dr. Malinzek, out to about right. It looks like, depending on the data that you look at, it's between $500 and $1 million to replace a physician. So if you're on the top of the earning, trajectory, then most likely it could cost the system a significant amount of dollars. And when you look at some of the nursing data, it also costs the system a significant amount of money to have nursing and staff turnover. There's increased divorce, rates of addiction, and then ultimately, we would never want anyone to kill themselves. And so that's one of the reasons why we need to actively address this. So again, kind of back to our data, so the WellBeing Index really allowed us to look at how did our physicians compare to some of the national samples. And what's interesting about the data, even though the N wasn't that great, we did see in some of our younger physicians, some of those who are just transitioning to their first job, that there appears to be greater risk of burnout. And one can imagine why that might be as you make that transition to ultimately being a faculty physician. The sense of responsibility is dramatically increased at that moment of time, and it's probably also the period of time when a developing physician begins to question, am I good enough? Do I really know what I'm talking about? And I can imagine that this would be very similar data for people who are transitioning from nursing school to ultimately being on the floors and being responsible. So as we look at, the good news about this, or the bad news about this data, before I move on to the next slide, is that we saw that Henry Ford, which is in the blue, we didn't have significantly more burnout than the national burnout rates, or in terms of distress or at risk. The bad news is that we still had 37.13% physicians that felt that were at risk. And I think that we should always strive to have that number be zero. We really don't want any of our physicians or faculty or staff or nursing staff to be in distress. So this is, as you know, a super hot topic, and there's been a lot of look at, well, what are some of the things that we believe are driving burnout? And we're not going to get into this too much, but I just kind of wanted to increase your awareness to it. But things like not feeling control in the workplace of the execution of your job, having heavy workloads, not having good work-life integration, not feeling a sense of community. Does any of this sound familiar to any of you? Interestingly, the nursing literature also looked at some of these things, and it's what's so interesting in looking at some of the nursing data was it was very similar to what we found in the physician data. Heavy workloads, long shifts, too much overtime, relationship conflict with staff, and we saw some of that stuff in the previous slide as well, but ultimately feeling a lack of reward. And we really see that it becomes this vicious cycle where you feel exhaustion, you take more risk, you have anger and self-criticism, suspiciousness, feelings of helplessness, cynicism, a sense of being besieged, and then a circle. So we really see that there's some correlation between those drivers for our nursing staff and those drivers that are present for our physician group as well. We decided, in terms of really trying to figure out what we wanted to do at Henry Ford, to look at what were some of the key drivers for people within this health system. And Dr. Jesse and I did a bunch of focus groups here at Henry Ford. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time other than to say that we found that the things that were the key drivers nationally were really correlative to what we found here at Henry Ford as well. So why do we think that this is? Why do we think that now there's more burnout than there's ever been before? Like, what do we think that might be related to? So there's Glenn Gabbert's a very famous psychiatrist, and he has looked at the healthcare provider personality. And so I think you have to kind of sit there as you're sitting here in the audience today and really think about that as a whole, does this kind of describe a little bit your personality in terms of being somewhat compulsive in providing healthcare to your patients? That ultimately, that compulsiveness, I was talking to a physician this morning, sometimes our greatest strength is kind of our greatest burden. The fact that we are compulsive, isn't that wonderful, because it means that we double check and we go the extra mile, but unfortunately there can also be a price to pay for that compulsiveness as well, leading to sometimes increased feelings of doubt, guilt, and exaggerated sense of responsibility. And so kind of what happens over time is that either that baseline personality adapts or it doesn't adapt. And when it becomes adaptive, things like being more thorough or more committed or desire to stay current, those are all good things, right, as a healthcare provider. But the maladaptive traits that can emerge as a result of that baseline personality is that sometimes you can have difficulty relaxing, or you feel like you're not doing enough, or you have difficulty setting limits. So hopefully as you're kind of sitting out there, you're asking yourself, what side am I on? Am I on the adaptive side? Have I used that compulsiveness in a positive way? Or do I actually see myself more here on the maladaptive side? So let's get to the meat of why we are here. We are here to talk about resilience. So now that I gave you some of the foundational data, and hopefully you're looking at it and thinking, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that seems like that's my personality. The good news is this word, resilience, we're going to talk a little bit more about what that word means in just a minute, but it is something that if you identify in yourself that you've developed a maladaptive way of kind of dealing with the stress in medicine, that you can learn to be more resilient. So the next slide, I'm going to actually show you a video. It's what I would say is a story of resilience. It's an emotional video. And afterwards, I'm going to be asking you what your thoughts are about the traits that you think Stephanie in this video show in terms of her resilience. I do want to warn you that some of the content is kind of disturbing, but I thought it is an amazing story of resilience, and I wanted to share it with you today. So let's go ahead and watch this video.
Please welcome to the stage Stephanie Somerville.
Okay, so I gotta say, hands down, my 20s were the worst years of my life. I spent most of my adult life trying to escape southern Indiana, which is where I'm from. And the thing you have to know about where I'm from is southern Indiana is highly prejudiced, highly racist, and terribly boring. So one of the things I was looking forward to was going to college. So I picked, back then we called them Negro colleges. It was part of the Negro College Consortium. I picked a black school down in Atlanta, Georgia to go down to so I could be with like my people. Because I was the only like black kid in like the middle income world of Evansville, Indiana, and it was highly boring. I knew nothing about my people, and we didn't have MLK Day and all those wonderful things. So I thought it would be great. I'm moving to Atlanta, I'm gonna experience the culture of the African diaspora, and it turned out to be the worst moments of my life. It first started, I went to this college, and the president decided to embezzle funds from the school. And the way he did that is he took loan checks and scholarship money from innocent kids in transition like myself. So that was the first thing that happened. The second thing that happened was when I was down there, I had an opportunity to work on a film set. I was like, it's really cool. And they were like, yeah, Steph, since you're part of the mass communications classes, you could take this and totally get credit. And so I was like, yay, this is great. So I'm working on this major motion picture. And about 3.5 weeks into it, the producers and the directors just up and left. They pulled out their trucks and they took everything away and they didn't tell anybody. So as a result, I lost my college credit for the class, which means that ruined my GPA. And as an overachiever, you do not fuck with my GPA, okay? Like, you could take anything from an overachiever, but you cannot fuck with the GPA. So that happened to me. I lost my scholarships. As a result, I lost my housing. And for 2.5 weeks, I became homeless. And I found a job at a McDonald's, and I slept on the stockroom floor till I could get my first paycheck, and I bought a bus ticket and came back to the place that I didn't want to, which was southern Indiana. So I get home to southern Indiana, and I knock on the door, and my mother's like, oh, you're here. So sorry, but I've sold your bedroom set to your grandmother, and your bedroom is no longer here. I've turned it into my sitting area, and it has a lovely 8-piece pit in the middle of it and a glass and brass table, so there was nowhere for me to stay. So in protest, I went to go live out in the garage with the car. So it was an unfinished garage, and I'm living there. I'm sleeping on the chaise lounge, the outdoor furniture that Mom had left, you know, that kind of breaks down. And I'm sleeping on it, and I am terribly, terribly depressed now. I'm sleeping something like 16 hours a day, and this goes on for a couple of weeks. And the thing you have to realize is that when you're clinically depressed, you have absolutely no energy. It's not just like, I'm sad. It's like you don't have energy to do anything. So I finally get up the nerve to open up a newspaper to look for a job in southern Indiana. So I opened up the paper, and I was so excited because this was the 80s, and the new thing was to have home health care aides. People that would go in and sit with the elderly, help to feed them, give them their medicine, things like that. So when I open up the page and I see it, it was like a hallelujah moment. It was like, oh, sitter. And I'm like, what better job for a depressed person than to have a job just sitting? That's all I had to do. And I was like, thank God I can go do this job. So I finally went to this place called Health Skills, and it was a temp agency. So they gave me my first assignment, and one of the things that they did not tell me is that when you're the new kid on the block, you get all the worst assignments. So as a sitter, for the first few assignments that I had only terminally ill patients, people that were dying. And I was like, oh joy. And the thing is, it can't be helped because other people want jobs with longevity. So I take this job, I walk up to this door, okay? And I'm knocking on the door. It's like a middle class, like working class, all white neighborhood, you know, frame house on cinder blocks with a little front porch. So I knock on the door, and the door has a window in it, and I see that they've got like these lace curtains, and I see this woman peer out, and she's like this thin, skinny, Sissy Spacek looking woman. And she looks at me and she says, "Go away!" And so I said, "Hi, ma'am. I'm here from Health Skills. I'm here because you needed a sitter." And I thought that would help. And she said, "Go away, I don't want you here." And so I tried to explain this to her again, and she said, "Fine." So she goes to what she does is she goes to the phone and she calls the company from where I'm from. And I'm standing outside, it's hot, it's kind of July and sticky, and I'm waiting on her to, you know, get through this phone call, and finally it feels like that she hasn't won, because she just slams down the phone, she comes to the door, and she opens it and lets me in. So I'm walking through this house, which is a lot like a railroad apartment here in New York. You have to walk through the living room, kitchen, finally to the bedroom, and the bathroom is off to the side, so you can see through all the way through the house. So we make our way to the back of the house, and I get to the bedroom, and I am hit with this horrible stench, and I had to immediately stop my own gag reflex. The air is filled with the smell of bile, and I look on the bed, and there's this man lying on a hospital bed in an otherwise regularly normal-looking bedroom, and he's on a gurney at a 45-degree angle. He has breathing tubes and IVs and that kind of stuff in him, and he's completely unconscious. And while he's on the bed, the breathing machine is working, and it's pumping up this brown mousse or foam. It kind of looks like the texture of styling foam. It's coming out of his mouth and nose. And what I discover is that this man is dying of cirrhosis of the liver, and in the final stages, the liver and the bile are breaking down. They're making their way, it's building up as fluid into the lungs, and the body is trying desperately to get rid of that so that it can breathe, and so that's what's coming up out of his mouth and nose. And so every 15 minutes, this process goes through, and I have to stand there and clean it up. So me being an overachiever and wanting this job and wanting to do well, I throw myself into the job, and I'm helping me. This woman who let me in is very like aggressive. She doesn't say anything, but she's not very kind to me, and she lets me know that very quickly. So we clean up this man, and there's nothing for me to do but to just wait, okay? So I'm like, okay, maybe I should just sit down. And I look at this woman, and she's staring at me like just hate pouring from her eyes. And I don't know what the hell I've done. I've just done my job, and I've done it pretty well, being, considering. So I tell her, I look at her, and I say, look, I can get this. I'm fine now. So she just turns around, doesn't say a word to me, and she walks right back down that hallway, and she goes and sits on the couch. And even though she's sitting across from the TV, she's sitting profile because she can see down the hallway, and she's staring like this. Here's the TV, and there's me down there. She's staring. She's got her eye on me. So I'm like, okay, fine. So I'm going to try to take this all in. I'm going to sit down, and I'm looking at the room, and it's filled with this nice Shaker furniture, and it's got a floor-to-ceiling Confederate flag behind the man's bed, and I'm just totally looking around. And the thing that I have to tell you is that when you are depressed, it takes a little while for the gears to kick in, and that's what's happening to me at this moment. So I'm taking in the furniture, there's a lovely armoire, and I'm so Martha Stewart, I'm into decorating and everything, so I'm actually kind of impressed, because it's very sparse, very thin, but very nice, old, antiquated furniture, and they have a little coat tree, and I see on the coat tree, I notice there is this beautiful robe, kind of like a church robe, except it's white, and it has a round circle with a white cross on it, and a hood. But I still am not taking this in because I am totally amazed by this hood and the buttonhole stitching that is going around the eyes of the hood, for the eye part. So I'm not paying attention. So I was like, maybe I should take up something, and then I look down the hallway as if, for explanation, and the woman is looking at me, and I'm looking at her, and, the way we deal with things in Indiana is that we kind of try to normalize things. So that's what I did, is I was like, okay, I'm just sitting here, oh, there's a table and there's a book on it, hooray. I have something to do now. So I pick up this book, and I'm standing there and I'm flipping through the book, and it looks like a Bible because it's got gilt lettering on the outside. And I was like, oh, great, it's a Bible, I know that. You know, Corinthians, Lutheran, Corinthians, Ephesians, Proverbs for wisdom, Psalms if you're sad, Genesis, the beginning. So I'm opening up the book, and I'm trying to look for something peaceful and happy to read. And instead, I come across this horrible-looking manifesto that talks about the superiority of the white race and how we need to annihilate everyone but them for their own safety. And I shut the book, and it finally hits me that I am in the home of an honest-to-God Klansman, and I am a black woman. And so I look down the hallway at this woman, and she's looking back at me like, don't you get this now? And I'm like, oh, shit, okay? So, but now, the mess is coming up again from this man's mouth and nose, and I'm like, oh, thank God, I got something to do. So I'm going to clean up this mess, and the stench is awful, and I'm looking at this man, and I'm like, I'm so glad he's not sentient, because this is horrible irony. I am helping to clean him up, and he's a white man. He probably hates me, and I don't hate him personally, but my people hate him, and there's all this kind of like anxiety and feeling, and I'm like, dude, we cannot do this right now, because I need a job, okay? Because I gotta get up out of the garage, and I am so depressed, I can't do anything, and I'm just like, we have to get through with this, okay? And I was thinking to myself, wait a minute, I'm an overachiever. I can totally do this. I am not gonna let a little racism stand in my way. I have got to get this done. I am gonna do it well. I am gonna get an A+, I'm gonna get a check, and I'm gonna get the fuck up out of here, okay? And that is exactly what I did. I did that every 15 minutes for 4 hours that day, for 4 hours. And I sat there and I watched him, and the woman, after a while, she went to go get something to eat, and she did get distracted by the TV. And at the end of the day, I came back the next day. And I came back, and she opened the door, and we went through the ritual again, and she wasn't quite as, unfriendly. I guess she recognized I was not gonna kill the man. We kept on with the same routine, and she did take a little bit of rest. And I came back again a third day. And the third day, she was getting more tired. And what I finally realized was that this woman was not getting any rest unless I was there to take care of him. That nobody would come to save her or to help her, which I thought was really sad. And by the fourth day, she just came to the door and immediately laid down, and I did the job, and I had to wake her up at the end of that 4 hours. And then on the fifth day, the temp agency called me, and they told me that the man had passed away. But the woman had called to leave me a message, and she had told them this, that he had had the best care that he had ever had since he had left the hospital, and that it was the most sleep that she ever got, the most peace that she ever had was when I was there, and that she wanted to thank me personally. And I thought, man, that is amazing. And she left me a tip, which the temp agency would not let me keep. But the thing that I get out of that is amazing, is this, that these two people had come together, these two incredibly desperate people, in a highly charged, highly provocative situation. We came together and our lives kind of touched. And in that touching, we kind of changed the trajectory of our lives forever. It started just a little bit there, And I'd like to think that I changed the way that she thought about people of color, that we weren't whatever it was that those people were teaching her, and that she could treat them with respect going forward. And for myself, what I got out of it was that I got a job, and I finished doing what I had to do, and it gave me something to do every day, which I desperately needed to do. And so it didn't matter. We did change our lives just a little bit right here. But further out on our life path, that added. It became even wider, the difference, and you could totally see it. Until the point where when I had left that city, I was literally in another state. And I was also in another state. Thank you.
Pretty heavy. So what do people think in terms of resilience? It's not rhetorical. I was really hoping that someone would say persistence. Dr. Brown.
I think even in her depression, she knew she had to move forward, and so the first step was to find a job, as bad as it was. But that she was creating her own plan that was moving her forward.
So Dr. Brown was saying that in spite of everything that had happened, she persisted and moved forward, and that she didn't let how difficult it was compromise that need to move forward. And what's so interesting in the context of the definition of resilience, it's the capacity to bounce back, to withstand hardship, and to repair yourself. And I thought that this video really shows how she came back from that and what she later learned from that and how that actually changed the course of her life. Yeah.
One definition of resilience is not only make you bounce back to the state you were at before, but that on occasion you exceed that after you've prepared yourself. So perhaps in her case, other people's cases, it's something to keep in mind.
Right. So the comment was about resilience. When you really expand the definition, it's really not just bouncing back, but oftentimes it's bouncing back in a way that makes you stronger, that makes you, and I think that this was a great example of she overcame something that I think most of us are kind of speechless to hear happened, and yet she became stronger as a result of it. She didn't just bounce back, but she was stronger as a result of what happened. So it's really this adaptation in the face of something that can be really difficult. And you too, hopefully you would never have to face anything like this, but you do face some pretty difficult things in the work that you do. So how can you learn how to bounce back, and how can you learn to even be stronger in the context of that? So what are some of the keys to resilience? Like how do you grow it? Certainly your home and those relationships at home are either going to enhance your ability to be resilient or not. So hopefully you have rejuvenating relationships in your home life that when you come here, they help sustain you. I think that I'm sure you've known many people in your life. Some are just more positive than other people, and I think your brain and your hormones and all those different levels are either going to make you more likely to be resilient or less likely. Who you surround yourself with, and even their degree of positivity and your respect for them, all of those things can help either build or break down resilience ultimately. But you're born with your own set of psychological tools. And as we look at resilience, we know that some of these different things are either things that you're good at or need to be better at as you try to develop yourself in becoming more resilient. So as you sit out in the audience, you're asking yourself, how am I when it comes to problem solving? Or am I someone who finds meaning in the work that I'm doing? How intelligent am I emotionally? Am I someone who has the capacity for positivity and is mostly positive and exudes that with others? And then what kind of narrative do I use to describe the different things that happen, the different stressors that happen in my life? As we look at some of the personality features that more resilient people have, it's really the ability to form warm and caring relationships, to have a sense that you have your own personal autonomy towards outcome, towards how it turns out at the end of the day. That it's not an external locus of control, it's what you kind of bring to the table and how you bring that to the table. It's perceiving yourself ultimately as being competent and being able. And it's a sense of the attitude that you bring with you as you do your work each and every day. So I'm going to give you a minute to look at this and give yourself a quick little test. This was a quiz that was adapted from Siebert, the Resiliency Advantage. You're supposed to rate yourself from 1 to 5, 1 being strongly disagree to 5 being strongly agree. And the higher your score, the more likely, the more resilient you are. So if you're not really 100% sure how resilient you are, you can find out right now. So I'm going to give you a minute, and then we're going to need to move forward. You can add it up in your head if you want. Well, hopefully, since you're all Henry Ford employees, or most of you are, that you've all found yourself to be highly resilient down here at the bottom. But I think that Sue will have my slides, so if you don't get a chance to complete this and you want to do it on your own, she can certainly send that out to you. But hopefully you found that you're at the bottom. But when you kind of look at the list of questions, you see some of the foundational things that I was talking about. So what do you see here? This is actually a picture from the hurricane. Which one was this? I have the reference down at the bottom. It probably is irrelevant, but this is a dock going out across the ocean. And I think if I looked at this, I would be like, oh my gosh, I do not want to go on this. Like, it looks like it's going to fall into the ocean at any minute, right? Do a lot of people kind of look at that and that's what they see? Like, this is pretty ominous. You'd have to be crazy to go out on it in the middle of a hurricane. Yeah. Now look at this picture. This is picture 2 of the hurricane. What do you see right there? It's kind of hard to see. Well, right here, what do you see? There's a person. And I think the point of it is, it's all about attitude, right? I mean, you can think of it as like this. Treacherous and beware and don't go there. Or you can think of it as a challenge that you want to overcome. So just kind of driving that point home. But I don't know, how many of you out there would actually be this guy? Probably not too many of you, but it really does drive home a good point. So in terms of Henry Ford, kind of bringing it back to Henry Ford, so in terms of really trying to decide how we're going to respond to those drivers, education and training is what I'm here today to do. But I put this slide in here because I wanted to make sure that you know that Henry Ford doesn't just think that's all they need to do to address burnout. I think that they recognize that we need to look at our processes and our policies, that we need to look at, do we have enough support? And so we are also spending energy talking about some of those institutional strategies, but today's talk is really about the purple box, which is the education and training. But I don't want it to be lost on, geez, they think that they can just come in and Dr. MacLean's going to talk and this is just going to be everything that we're going to be trying to do to address it here at Henry Ford. That is not the case, but that is the box that we're talking about today. So what are some of the ways? So let's now get down to the tools. We have about 17 minutes left, and we're going to quickly go through some of the different tools that you can use in your life to build better resilience. These are all personal strategies, but again, I don't want you to think that these are the only things that Henry Ford is doing to try to address the burnout that our physicians are experiencing here. We're going to go through each of these different ones that are listed, but I really love Tigger because I think life is not about how fast you run or how high you climb, but how well you bounce. So in terms of resilience, that's what we want to teach you to learn how to do. So the first strategy that we're going to talk about is informal mindful practice. And so if you didn't already get a communication, at least for the docs, we will be having a mindful practice workshop that we're going to be doing in June. And if you're interested in learning more about mindful practice, I really encourage you to sign up for it. But we have opportunities throughout the course of our day to really practice mindfulness. I know for me, walking in my car or even while I'm brushing my teeth or right before I settle in with a patient, or one of the places that I actually practice most of my mindful practice is I've driven home and I'm now standing on my side porch right before I go into the chaos of my life at home. I have 2 teenagers and there's always a lot of activity and there's always other kids in my house, and so I always take that mindful moment to say, okay, it's time to take off the doctor hat and put on the mom hat. So it's at that point that I always take a deep breath and I allow my thoughts to clear, and I go in, but I really take that moment, because I find that if I don't kind of brush off what happened in the day, that I'm actually not ready to face that next setting. So you too can practice this in a variety of different ways, but really just taking that breath, allowing your thoughts to clear, to not really have judgment in that moment, and then just go in kind of a nirvana sort of way, enter into the next place. Negative bias, I think that this is true of clinicians as a whole, again, whether or not you're a nurse or whether or not you're a physician. Oftentimes we spend a lot of time in the state of thinking about what we did wrong. We let those negative things define how we feel. I don't know about you, but I have a hard time kind of looking at my successes. I only see all the places where I failed. And those become how I define myself. And so I think it takes a lot of practice to move over from that negative place. It's because of oftentimes being in that negative space that has driven us to excel, that's driven us to work harder. But unfortunately, as a sustainable sort of quality of living your life, it's not really a good place to be in. We oftentimes give that negativity more power than we do the positivity. We're blinded by all the positive things. We overestimate the threats and we underestimate the opportunities. So the first step to beginning to kind of change that negative bias that you have and that space that you live in is to recognize first that you do it. And I do see a couple of you out there shaking your head like, yeah, I know I have a tendency to do that. So it means you have to be open to recreating that narrative, to having a different script to really describe what happened. And it means really looking for those simple pleasures. It's interesting because one of the things I've been trying to do, I supervised a resident clinic on Monday. And right before I came here, one of the residents came in and we had a patient come in who's doing great, who's responded to antidepressants. His depression is in full remission. So after she saw the patient, I went in and the resident is there and the patient is doing great. And I said, isn't it wonderful to be the easy patient today? And he had a big smile on his face. And I said, I want to just thank you for being, and I said the doctor's name, for being her happy moment today. It's so wonderful that you're feeling good. And I want to make sure that that our resident really feels good about the work that she's done with you. And he's like, yeah, and I want to thank you so much. I feel so much better. But I think sometimes we don't take those moments to really spend a moment kind of feeling it. And I think that was important. So I'm really trying to model that even in the supervision that I provide to our residents. You need to cultivate these positive emotions. There's actually, has anyone ever participated in something called smiling or laughing yoga? Well, at this mindful practice workshop, he does this, it's not really yoga, but he does this mindful laughing exercise. And there's actually a YouTube video out there where there's this guy on the subway, and suddenly he just starts to laugh. And then as he starts to laugh, people around him are like, who is this guy? What is he doing? And then they start to laugh. And then suddenly the entire car, everyone is laughing, and they have no idea why they are laughing. But they are, and you see that when you smile, other people smile. When you laugh, other people laugh. And it can become really infectious. But if you're frowning and you're angry, guess what? That's infectious too. So smiling, laughing, showing appreciation, spending time actually in a reflective way of thinking about what we appreciate, what we're grateful for, can really get us more into that positive space. Emotional self-regulation, and this is something that I've heard Dr. Abeljoud talk about, that you have to own kind of how you react. And I think you oftentimes really have to think about who gets your best self. And this is something that I've spent a lot of time working on, because I found that my patients and the residents always got my best self. And then I'd go home and I'd be grumpy. My family, my children, were getting my terrible self. And it's not to say that your work should get your terrible self and your home should get your best self, but I think it has to be an active process that we really try to be our best self at home too, not just with our patients, not just with our colleagues. And it does take effort. But it means reapprising, doing things different, building that emotional intelligence, being in tune with that, and learning how to take care of yourself. There's all kinds of personal recharge activities that you can do. I'm not going to go through all of these, but of course having good self-care, keeping a schedule, knowing I don't have two different schedules. I have my home schedule and my work schedule together. Because if I didn't do that, I would never do stuff at home. Sometimes when people are asking me to do stuff, if I don't know that my kid has an activity because it's on this work schedule, then I'm going to say yes to that, and guess what? I'm going to miss that thing at home. And so I would really recommend that people keep them all on the same schedule. That you also think about how you want to spend your downtime, and that you do things that rejuvenate you. And then if you don't have a bucket list, you're never too young to have a bucket list. And I think what I try to do is have things on my bucket list that might be something I could accomplish every 2 to 3 years. So one of the things I have on my bucket list was I wanted to read the 100 greatest books ever written. And I've been working on that bucket list for a long time. And I think I'm on number 86. And I've now settled down to some of the most difficult ones, and that's why they're still on the shelf. But you have to think about, a bucket list activity isn't necessarily just a trip you want to do. It may be something else that would really bring you meaning, something else that you would want to do in your life, that you just feel like that's a goal, that's something I want to do. You have to invest in your well-being. Interestingly, we looked at some of the burnout data and how it correlated with engagement, with the engagement outcomes that we got, and we did see that there is a correlation between engagement. Your well-being, it's not just about, though, increasing that engagement. It's also about finding good work-life balance and finding joy and meaning in your work. And even though I don't have this data for nurses, there was a presentation that came out of, a paper that came out of Mayo by Shanafelt that really looked at if you just spent part of your day doing stuff that really rocks you, that can sustain you. So even as nurses who are sitting out here thinking about, if you're a nurse and you really love teaching, is there a way that you can do that a little bit more if that's the thing that's going to help sustain you in providing a care to patients over the long term? But we need those things that really rock us in order to sustain us through those difficult times. Finding joy in what you do, whether or not it's in medicine or patient care, or even we have some support staff here, but reflecting on what you do well, looking beyond the mundane. For our clinicians out there, really recognizing your role as a healer, how important it is to be there on the journey with the people that you're on the journey with, and to be present in that moment, to respect the experience of the illness, and to actually, I think one of the things that people are talking about correlates with burnout is not really feeling like they have the time to still talk to patients. And so how do you still do that in a way that can help find that meaning? Because every person, has that unique story, and if you're not going to spend time actually knowing that story, I think you're going to find it difficult to maintain your sustainability in medicine. And of course, there's no presentation that we could have that can't have a William Osler quote, so I had to include one for you. But you could substitute, I think, healthcare provider. The healthcare provider knows the disease the patient has, but the great healthcare provider knows the patient who has the disease. So really spending time and being present with that patient is going to be something and is something that the literature says prevents burnout. And so, unfortunately, we don't have time for this activity, but I was going to have you, I hope that you'll just take a moment after you leave today to really think about, of all the things you do, which gives you the most joy and meaning? And what percentage of the time do you actually spend doing that? And how can you change that? So I think I have one more slide. So the ultimate strategy, so when they looked at everything that helps prevent burnout, the number one thing that they found is that you must find meaning in the work that you do. And that if you feel that you have meaning in the work that you do, it will help decrease your risk for burnout. And this, Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist. He was Jewish, and he, interestingly, was living in Eastern Europe during World War II. He had an opportunity to immigrate to the United States, but he was married and his wife was pregnant and his parents were there, and they did not get visas. So instead of leaving, he stayed to support his family. They all ended up in a concentration camp, and he was the only one of the entire group who survived. And he wrote, he's written many books. One of the books is called The Meaning of Life. And he said, "There is nothing in the world, I venture to say, that would so effectively help one to survive even the worst conditions as the knowledge that there is meaning in one's life. There is much wisdom in the words of Nietzsche. He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." And then finally, I think another thing that he says that is very powerful is between stimulus and response, there is space. In that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. So what are you going to do with your space? And how are you going to fill that space? We have resources here available for you if you want to reach out. These can also be found on our physician well-being or physician wellness page. All you have to do is stick it in there, and you'll find all of these different resources. And certainly if anyone has any need for any help, I want to make sure that they know that there's a lot of available resources for you here. So I want to thank you for your attention and take any questions if anyone has a couple of questions.
Thank you, Lisa. That was really outstanding and I think really helpful to the whole group. Questions from the group? Dr. Van Cash.
I'm a retired physician, so I'm not in the burnout at this time. You said a lot of things about what we can do to build up resilience. I was wondering what the institution is doing to address this problem.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Venkat. And I did mention that, we collected all of that data, and I've been meeting with the executive committee, and actually, I think 10 days ago, met with the Board of Governors. And at this point in time, the ask list is huge. And I think I was asked to narrow that down. And so in 2018, the institution is going to be investing in some developmental coaching. So not just when someone's struggling. And the other thing that they're going to be investing in is building on the mentoring program that they developed initially and then kind of fell by the wayside because there was no project manager. So they'll be hiring a project manager and bringing that back to speed We'll also be doing the mindful practice workshop, but there is so many things. My list was extensive, like a scribe pilot program, continued MA education and support, a physician EAP. I mean, the list, a physician dining room or a clinician provider dining room, a fitness room on site. I mean, I think I scared Dr. Popovich because, you know, when it added up, it was like, well, if they could find some endowed philanthropy person to give us several $1 million, I could easily spend that. Lots of things we could do.
One of the things I found personally very stressful was dealing with the demands of the electronic medical record.
Yeah.
And so much of the things that we put in there, meaningless, nobody reads it, but we're still doing this for revenue purposes and so on. And I think addressing that issue will be a major contributor to reducing stress in physician and in supporting staff.
Yeah. My understanding is there is already an Epic workflow analysis group that can come in and kind of look a little at what you're doing and try to help you to streamline that. I think everybody I talk to, they would love to get rid of Epic, but I think it would then just be replaced by another electronic medical record. I think it's here to stay. And so how do we become a super user? How do we learn to manage that in a way that allows us to be efficient? And I think the system needs to continue to look at, do we need to really press all of those buttons or not? Mm-hmm. Right. So Dr. Whitehouse was really talking about like why is this happening now more than it happened before? And I think there is a lot of literature out there that's looking at that, and honestly, no one has the absolute answer. I think it's a lot of things coming together all at once that seems to be, and I don't know if Michelle, you want to address this, but it seems to be a lot of things coming together all at once.
Yeah, I mean, the existing literature was suggesting a lot of things coming at once, but I think what you're tapping into is accurate. What you're tapping into is accurate in the sense of saying why physicians report, in particular, why they report going into medicine, and then and the actual practice of medicine are not aligned. So in other words, how we practice medicine now.
Well, there were two things I wanted to do when I was a medical student at Presbyterian Hospital in Chicago. One, I wanted to be an obstetrician
But you didn't end up doing that. Yeah. But I think talking about managing expectations is really important, and I think managing expectations is very important, and it's probably one of the reasons why even the LCME has said we need to do wellness programming even at the medical school level. And interestingly, I think that it's beginning to even reach out into undergrad. You know, is it societal? Is it our expectations? Is it the loss of humanness in the work that we're doing? Again, I think it's very complex, but I know it's a little past 1. I really appreciate everyone's patient attentiveness, and I really thank you for coming to my presentation.